Hello and welcome to Stork'd, the podcast, in which we explore the many ways to build and define family. This is Julia, your host, and today I want to talk to you about egg freezing and fertility preservation and introduce you to a wonderful guest, Cameron Rogers. Cam and I share the experience of having preserved our fertility through freezing our eggs. And we both did it for somewhat similar but very different reasons and had somewhat similar but very different experiences with it. If you've ever uttered the words, you know what, just freeze your eggs, everything will be fine, to a friend that's having trouble dating, or to a friend who's not sure if they want kids, or to a friend who is investing elsewhere in their lives, don't worry. It's okay. Just freeze your eggs. This is the episode for you because it's more complicated than that. It's way more nuanced. And it's also the episode for you if you've ever thought about fertility preservation, if you've ever thought about freezing your eggs. And I say this with gritted teeth. Sometimes my mom is right. And many years ago when I turned 30, my mom said, you know what, sweetheart, just freeze your eggs. And I think she had all the right intentions, but I was so angry at her. I was so hurt by this suggestion that I might just freeze my eggs because it suggested that maybe my dating life was failing. But if your mom has ever pressured you to freeze your eggs, this is the episode for both of you to listen to. One of the things that I think is so remarkable about fertility preservation, about freezing your eggs, is that so much of our family building experiences, and really our lives, are dictated by the world around us. Things happen to us, they happen for us, they happen despite us, but very rarely do we have complete control over our narrative, our family building journey, our experiences. And here is this one tool that lets us literally press pause and say, I'm going to store my eggs, a portion of my body, literally frozen in time while the rest of me ages. I wish I could do that, frankly, for my wrinkles. Little Botox joke. And yet, there are so many reasons to make the decision to press that pause, to put a pin in family building. There's because you haven't met a partner yet or the right person yet, which is one of the reasons I did it. There's because you want to take the pressure off of dating and date for the joy of it, which is one of the reasons that Cam did it. There is investing in your current family. Maybe you're taking care of a sick family member, or you and your partner need a little bit more time to deepen your relationship before you're ready to have kids. There is investing in your career and saying, I'm going to go all out in my professional life before I'm ready to have kids. And we talk about all of those things. We also talk about the shared sisterhood that comes with making this choice, making this leap into the preservation journey. And so what other tool is there that allows you to literally rewrite the book of your life, to wreck the ship, to reform the trajectory of your life's path than this? It's incredible. Yet, it is imperfect. It is outrageously expensive, even when insurance or other resources help support you to pay for it. It takes a huge toll on your body. It takes time. And after all that, it may not work. And so we just talk about all of those things. As always, if you love Stork'd, if you love this episode, don't forget to share with a friend who could benefit from it. Like us on anywhere that you listen to podcasts, follow social media, and don't forget we have a really awesome newsletter. Sign up for that. Here is Cam. I'm so excited, Cam, to continue our conversations. You and I have been having quite a lot of conversations over the past couple of months about fertility preservation, what it means emotionally, what it means, logistically, and then also access to doing something as important as egg freezing. And here you are having just finished this momentous life thing, which is freezing your eggs. And so I want to talk a little bit about that and how one plans for something like that.
Yeah, I'm excited to be here. Thank you, Julia. And you truly have seen kind of the progression of thinking about it. I think we connected my first day of the stimulation and whatnot, and I've had a couple of weeks since to reflect on it. So I think you truly have seen the thought process. So excited to talk about it in more detail.
That's fabulous. Well, before we do that, let's talk about who you are. Would you mind giving our audience a little introduction to everything that is Cam Rogers?
I guess I'll start with my roots. I'm a Californian in New York, 9 years and counting, which I never expected. It amazes me every day. I think in terms of my life and socially, I'm kind of one of those funny ones that straddles the lines of being convener and getting people together and deriving real joy from that, but also needing my alone quiet, introspective time to reflect, think, and listen. For anyone who knows me, they're like, yep, that's probably spot on in terms of the barbells of Cam. Personally and professionally, I very much obsess about how to get more money into the hands of women. So that very much factors into what I'm doing professionally at Elevest. And I guess lastly, I'll just say I love and obsess about art in many forms. And so I find New York for me has brought community, but there's also that element of living here. And I find it's plentiful and accessible here. That's another, I guess, passion point.
Oh my gosh, there's no better place to be if you're obsessed with art than New York City. It's all around you, it's in the air. It's such a wonderful way to hear somebody and really get their complete perspective, who they are as somebody who's both introverted and extroverted and really appreciates the arts, as well as supporting women to have control over their financial destiny. And one of the things that we've talked about with regard to egg freezing is the sense of creating and control over your personal destiny as well. Can you talk to us a little bit about your family life and your origin story to some extent? Because I think that sort of plays into figuring out where you are at this snapshot in time.
I am the eldest of two daughters. I also have a half sibling. My parents are from the US, so they hail from the Midwest and South specifically, and their children born in the 1940s. They ended up having me, I guess, what would be qualified as later in life. I'm going to get so much trouble making this statement if they ever listen to this podcast. I guess they were older parents, but they had me in their early 40s. No problem at the time. When they were thinking about having another child, they actually had a lot of trouble conceiving, unfortunately. They ended up pursuing adoption when I was about 3 and adopted my sister, Casey. The interesting thing is that their fertility struggle at the time manifested into one of the best things that could have ever happened to me, right? Being Casey's older sister. It was just an interesting dynamic because for anyone who's pursued the adoption process, I was an only child and then I had a sister. But that was our unit growing up. That changed, I guess, pretty dramatically when my parents divorced, when Casey and I were young. And that experience, witnessing that firsthand and a lot of the family-related trauma around that has actually led me to be deeply passionate about the topics of financial confidence and personal agency when it comes to money, and was very much a factor in me pursuing my professional route at Elevest, which is a financial services company that focuses on getting more money into the hands of women. There are many ways to do that. We focus on the investment and planning side of the equation and tangential things like coaching and career coaching and money coaching. And I work with a lot of clients where I'm their direct point of contact in anything money related. They may not have the family or the friends or the network to talk about it. So that's a long-winded way of talking about our unit, but I think it brings in a lot of the background that I think we'll talk about.
But I think it's so helpful, and thank you very much for sharing that, because there are several things that are thematic and that will come up as we all explore our lives. And one of those you said is agency. I think we're definitely going to talk about that quite a bit. I'm curious if we just stay in the moment with your family's experience coming together as a unit, how your parents communicated or dialogued the adoption process to a 3-year-old and then ultimately to your sister. Because as I understand it, the way we talk about adoption to children now is a little different than we did in the 70s, 80s, and 90s. What was your experience hearing about adoption?
Yeah, I have to be honest. And this is unfair to my parents because I am sure that they communicated this to me, but it was sort of a 0 to 60 thing, like was by myself and then had a sister. And I'm sure there were moments where they were trying to describe what they were thinking, but I actually don't personally remember that. I will joke a little bit as a 3-year-old. I think the biggest thing growing up was ensuring that Casey was no different in terms of siblings. The most angry my parents have ever been at me in my lifetime is when Casey and I were in an argument. I remember this to this day. It's my greatest regret, I think, in life. Casey and I were arguing about something and she rebutted with this and I rebutted with that. And then I rebutted with something, blah, 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 because you are adopted. And I have never seen my parents so angry with me. And I regret that kind of comment to this day. But you grow up with these memories and growing pains, and they're different with every family.
Thank you for sharing that. It's not similar, but it used to be one of those things that you said is like an insult to kids, right? And so I did the same. My youngest sister is 9 years younger than me. My middle sister and I used to tease her, like, you must have been adopted, or you must have been a mistake, or something along those lines. And obviously, we knew she wasn't adopted. We were there for the process, but it was one of those things that kids tease each other with. And then I remember my mom looked at me at one point and said, she was the most wanted. We tried so hard. It's not quite the same, but you have to change your framing from the experience of building our family is not a negative thing. It's who we are. It's wonderful. And we're now a beautiful family unit, but you have to get rid of the like kid teasing a little.
Right. And I hope that kids have different sort of methods and frameworks to think about that today. Like, I hope that types of comment and teasing never comes up, but it unfortunately came up for us.
It's interesting that your parents' divorce has driven you to feel this sense of passion around self-agency and controlling your own destiny and feeling empowered in your own life choices and financial stability. And one of the things is thinking about investing in your future, the preferred future that you want to have. And that brings us full circle. I mean, we're talking about egg freezing. There is no more clear physical, financial, emotional investment in a possible future, not even like a defined or promised future, but a possible future than egg freezing. Can you tell us a little about what you were thinking about when you decided to make this choice to move forward with egg freezing?
I should mention for the group who's listening so that listeners know, I am a 34-year-old single cisgender straight white woman living in New York City. So I say all of this because my experience with egg freezing is a small sliver of experiences, right? Like for those egg freezing, that's not lost on me. Everyone will come to the table with different backgrounds, different stories.
And it's so helpful to have that reminder that there are those of us who come to it because we're thinking about fertility preservation as like, maybe this could happen one day. And there are those who have to come to it for different reasons, some of which might include a diagnosis or a partner's diagnosis or something else.
Absolutely. And with egg freezing and me, the decision was very much born out of a lot of observations during the pandemic. I had a number of friends that had gone through the process before the pandemic who were wonderful. They were like, if you ever want to do this, I'll be a resource. Like, we're here. And to be quite honest, my response was like, this is this thing that I do down the road, but I'm not there. And during the pandemic, I think we can all relate to this. We all very much saw the like upending of things, processes, institutions,
yes.
right?
Yes.
Schooling where we typically schooled, we weren't working where we typically worked, like cultural norms were being debunked. I think one thing for me is I observed people making decisions for themselves, their family, their community that like otherwise would have been totally considered unconventional, like historically unconventional, but in many ways over the last couple of years, like we're all embracing unconventional in some facet of our life.
And love that we're doing that, right? There's so many horrible things that have come out of this pandemic, but some really amazing stuff too. And let's embrace the unconventional. I like the way you just described that.
And talking unconventional, for me personally, I felt some like little bit of reprieve in the last couple of years from being what I assume is unconventional. I mean, like I'm kind of laughing saying this, but like single woman in her 30s who's still dating, trying to figure it out, do the thing. I guess that's unconventional.
I'm going to jump in there. It's so interesting that you just labeled all of those things as unconventional. And to some extent, I feel like that's the old perception, the old way of looking at the world as saying somebody in their 30s who's still single must be unconventional. And the word unconventional is interesting because you didn't say abnormal. It's not atypical, right? It's very normal these days for women in their 30s, particularly those who have great careers or growing professionally, to not have a partner. And yet we still wear with us in our hearts. And I'm saying we because that was my shared experience. That's interesting, right?
100%. And I laughed when I said it because it's humorous to say unconventional, because in many ways, I think what I gained the last couple of years in perspective, I felt like I lost in time. I specifically felt that with the clock problem, right? Like fertility is a tough math problem where so much revolves around time, and whether someone is kind of going through this process or not, we can all relate to some moment of being on the clock. Like I think of watching basketball. My dad's like a rah-rah UNC basketball fan. I think of the basketball player who like ad nauseum practices their 3-point shot like again and again and again. But the difference in trying to hit that 3-pointer when there are people screaming at you and the buzzer is going off and whatnot, Similar for anyone. I've taken a lot of standardized tests in my life. Someone taking a standardized test, you get a problem set in front of you and you're like, I've done this before. This should be easy. But again, it's very tough to work through when you only know you have a few minutes to do it. So kind of my mini realization was that when we're making decisions under the clock, we think differently, we process differently, we act differently. It's just like a totally different mode. I personally didn't want to be of that mindset and mode given where I am now, both personally and professionally. I think I'm my best self yet. That's challenged on a daily basis, but I'm just going to say it. I'm going to put it out into the universe. And I want to be able to make decisions with clarity and without this silent, I'll go as far as to say overpowering buzzer in the background. That's the long-winded way about talking about my logic.
That's really interesting. First, love the analogy because as I'm hearing you talk about that 3-point shot, you can feel the pressure of the crowd. You can feel the sweat. You can feel the team members relying on you. And you can feel that moment of like, maybe I whiffed it because the pressure's mounting. When you're specifically talking about decisions for which you're afraid of making a bad choice because the pressure is mounted. What kind of decisions? Are we talking about dating? Are we talking professionally? Are we talking about life choices? What's the fear?
The fear is very much anchored in professional life and I guess dating. I'll start with dating. I think most people are of the view that like you should approach meeting new people and dating if it's dating with this energy of like genuine curiosity, getting to know someone, knowing what drives them, their passions, et cetera. Like that's really fun, right? Like that is connection, right? Whether it's romantic or not. One should never enter a conversation or sit across the table from someone new and be thinking, is this a viable partner? Like, what could this look like long term? That's not a productive conversation for anyone or internal conversation for anyone. It's not fair to you. It's not fair to the other person. And I do think it's like very much a limiting mindset when meeting people. And I do think that when you're, again, feeling this burden of the clock or internal buzzer, or whatever you want to call that, unfortunately, like the waters get muddied with that type of thinking. From a career perspective, it's truly just runway. If I think about my career and where I am and where I want to go, it took some time to get to the place where I am personally and professionally. And so that kind of took me to Elevest. And we have a ton of momentum. I know you've experienced like conversations around this momentum over the last several weeks. It's also a lot of work and you need runway to do that. Runway is also time and that's that time component.
I'm going to ask 2 questions and one is admittedly not fair. If I'm going to just rephrase what I'm hearing you say, I want to hear if this resonates for you. What I'm hearing you say is you're finally at a place in your career where all this hard work that you've been building to has culminated into a job that you really love, that is hard work and it requires a lot of yourself, but is exciting. And if you had to make a decision today to step away from the workforce to have kids for a short period of time, it might feel like you were derailing your career.
That feels right. There hasn't been a moment or an opportunity yet where I felt like I've been at a crossroads to make that type of decision. The bigger decision is, do you kind of work somewhere that's stable? I'm not going to ever say easy, but stable and consistent and kind of use some of that extra time and stability to apply that somewhere else. I think that was always the bigger decision, but I haven't been at a crossroads where it's like this versus that, if that makes sense.
So it's a theoretical exercise, but there's one path where you're giving your career your all and you're going full out. And there's another path where you may still be doing a tremendous job at work, but you may be choosing to allocate your time resources a little differently, like towards a family.
And bringing family back into it. And I don't think she'd be upset if I talked about this, but when my mom had me, she stopped working and she's double Northwestern grad, worked for a bank, lived abroad, had a very solid career and made that decision at the time. And she will say, and again, I don't think I'm stepping on any toes when I'm saying this, but she said removing herself completely from the workforce made it very hard to be engaged in work. It made it very hard at the time that my parents were separating and divorcing and whatnot. And so I think there's also that element in the back of my mind.
If you were going to give name to that element, what is it?
I mean, for her, it was regret. For me, it would be loss of control or agency. It probably goes back to agency. Key for me was the option. I wanted the option. I didn't want someone to tell me down the road, pursuing the option later, that it wasn't a viable option at that time. So that was the thought process behind it.
So tell us a little bit about your experience with egg freezing. Were there difficult moments like choosing a doctor or going through the medication process or the actual retrieval that you want to share with the audience? Can you give anyone who's considering it but doesn't really know what it entails a very quick summary?
Absolutely. I'll talk about who I worked with, which was Spring Fertility, who I can't recommend enough. And this is no kickback here. This is me genuinely saying they were truly wonderful. For me, I actually had, through my first screening with them, something come up that actually needed to be addressed surgically prior to even thinking about egg freezing. So one piece of feedback and recommendation for anyone considering it is potentially just doing that first consult, that first appointment, because you never know what's going to come up. For me, I was amazed with the process. There was a community around me in terms of individuals who had done it before and gone through the process. And I realized that's a perspective of privilege, and I'm privileged to have that experience. But I found the community element actually really striking for something that is so deeply personal and so isolating. I'll give you an example because we actually talked that the day that I started all of the injections and hormones and whatnot, we actually talked that day. It was also the day that Elevest, my company, announced Series B fundraise, which is like a really important milestone for us. So there was just kind of all of the exciting energy around that. And then I had an event that evening. And so for anyone who like knows the process of that first evening of shots, it's really scary. It's really daunting. So there was this kind of moment where ended the event. I like ran home and grabbed like all of the medications. Like, I hope I have the right stuff. One of my girlfriends, Nicole, kindly offered, come over to my apartment. I'll show you what to do. We'll have like the YouTube video up to do it. So we're there, like everything laid out, ready to go. We're following the YouTube video. There was one question we had about some part of the process. So we ended up FaceTiming my friend Carolyn. And so there's kind of this like comedic moment of community, like with something that's so deeply personal. I thought about it afterwards and I kind of equated, I don't know if you had this experience growing up, but there was a moment for me kind of at the age of 9 or 10 and my girlfriend community then at the time, like somehow all of the parents, probably moms, but maybe dads too, came together and like decided to gift the body book at the same time. I don't know if you had this experience. It was like the equivalent of like an album drop for someone who was like 9 or 10. We were going through it and kind of just like, whoa, like this is crazy stuff. And this moment, 20 years later on that first night of injections kind of felt like that same community. Okay, like we're going through this together.
So I'm laughing so hard for two reasons. One is because your analogy of getting the body book, it's interesting because it's one of those things where we all typically hit these milestones around the same time. You kind of go through puberty around the same time. You may or may not go to college around the same time. But then our lives start to diverge and you start to see some friends settle down, some friends accelerate careers, some friends travel. All of a sudden, you feel like you're walking this path alone to some extent. And so what I'm hearing you say is that even though there's a divergence of those milestones, there's a coming together in community around this one moment of taking control of your fertility.
100%. There absolutely is. One other thing about the experience, and this was a hurdle for me, is the celebratory aspect of it, which I thought I had actually mastered. And then this was an awakening for me. So I had been texting with a couple of friends who I hadn't seen in a while. They didn't know I was doing this. And they like reached out and were like, let's get together, for a drink or something. And I was kind of like, would love to, just this is what I'm doing. Like I might have to cancel. I'm not sure how I'll feel. And in pretty much like every instance, when I texted that to a friend, I received congratulations. I'm so excited for you. Like, I'm so proud of you, to the point where I was actually uncomfortable and to the point where I questioned what I had texted them. And if they had misinterpreted what I was doing, like maybe they thought I was thinking about, having a child on my own. And I had to pause and be like, Cam, like they're celebrating you because this is a big thing and you're not celebrating you. And you should truly be thinking about, this is something I'm doing because I'm sort of rocking and rolling in other parts of life. It was an extreme realization for me.
It's so funny. So I'll tell a story and then I want to talk about the celebration thing for a second because I think it's so important. But even as I was talking just now about the community aspect, I had forgotten 2 egg freezing stories. The first is one of my best friends did it a year or 2 after I did it. And she and I went to a sound bowl meditation on her first day. And this is back when he would like be in public and breathe together, which is crazy in the post-pandemic world. But we did this like beautiful restorative meditation, and her intention was to go home and do the treatment afterwards. But we're feeling ourselves. We decided to go grab a drink at a bar right next door. And we ended up injecting her in the bathroom stall of this bar because she's like, I'm feeling relaxed. This is the right time. I've got to hit my medication. And then that's how she learned on her first day. But of course, I did it the opposite way, where like day 3, I went on a setup date, which was a disaster. And I'm sitting there thinking, well, I'm trying to take control of my fertility because I'm dating idiots like this person right here. So I think the way you've done it is much better in a sense of community.
Yeah. And I preferred to do the injections at home naturally, but there were like a few nights I had to go to some events. So it was kind of in the bathroom trying to balance everything and not break expensive medication. So you pick where you may be uncomfortable. The kind of biggest physical manifestation for me was I was very tired. Like my eyes were actually closed at 4 p.m. and I couldn't help it. And so from a psychological perspective, the hardest thing for me was sort of treating myself with grace, especially with the mode I was going in, working and whatnot. And I wasn't performing at peak level and I felt bad about it. And I had to continue to remind myself to kind of treat that moment with a large degree of grace and remind myself that it's 2 weeks. And I think probably externally, I didn't miss a beat, but it was something that definitely weighed on me. I'll tell a funny story. I really didn't think that the hormones were affecting me emotionally. I was actually like, you're okay, like you're fine. And then there was one day, do you know the actor Mandy Patinkin?
Yes.
Yeah, like Inigo Montoya, Princess Bride. So I love him. I think he's a national treasure. I follow him on Instagram. Like I think he's terrific.
He has a tremendous Instagram.
He has a tremendous Instagram. Well,
right?
So you may know what I'm about to say. Within the last few weeks, he was introduced to kombucha, the beverage, and had a whole segment on his Instagram on attempting to pronounce kombucha, which he couldn't. And like, I just started crying. I just like national treasure, like being silly. I just like started sobbing and I was like, okay, maybe I'm not as fully kind of like in tune with the emotional part. What is tough for individuals who may be coming at this from a similar position as me is this is a big investment in something that is not totally apparent. And what you have to think through is just because it's not apparent doesn't mean it's not important. But that was sort of the initial hurdle that I had to get through when thinking about the financial component.
Okay, so let's talk about the financial component. First of all, it's a big one. And secondly, it's really something that may impact someone's decision. You're a financial planner. You get to wear that hat as well as somebody who's just gone through it personally. I were sitting in front of you as your client and said, I'm thinking I might want to preserve my fertility, but I don't know how to consider my finances in doing so. What would your advice to me be? How would you advise me to think about this undertaking?
I think I would acknowledge for the person, just so there's no feeling of regret, that it's a really tricky goal to solve for in its current form. And it's a tricky goal for a couple of reasons. There's this socialization component. I've talked so much about community in this cohort, but I truly don't believe that egg freezing as a personal pathway is highly socialized. Like it has been in like my kind of little unit group and whatnot, but I think a lot of the reasoning behind that, and I'd love your opinion and you can tell me I'm wrong, is the fact that it's still considered elective by the healthcare community. And even though healthcare and healthcare insurance policies may cover parts of an infertility diagnosis and treatment costs and whatnot, procedures like egg freezing aren't covered. Often someone may be lucky where they do have an employer sponsored benefit that does exist, but I find that is the exception and not the norm. And
it's like a unicorn sighting, like.
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
So unusual. Yeah.
Everybody's talking like, oh, progeny and carrot. And you're like, it's amazing. It's terrific. It needs to be, again, more of a norm in terms of a benefit, but it's serving a small community. And I think that when something is qualified as elective and in a lot of cases not covered by insurance or by a company, there's going to inherently be this hurdle when planning for it. The other tricky component of the planning piece, as I mentioned before, is it may not be clear in its current form. It could be deeply obscure. There's something different about a young individual, a young newborn, young baby being in front of you and this energy around, oh my goodness, there is this small person in front of me and they're going to have to go to school soon. And then they may go to college and they may do this and they may do that. And it kind of gets the wheels turning on the planning front.
I'm just trying to understand what you're saying a little bit more. It sounds to me like you're saying that planning for maybe having a baby in the future when you're at a different point in your life is so conceptual. It's so not real yet. It's hard to sit down and say, yes, I'm ready to start saving for this. Is that what you're kind of talking about?
That's what I'm saying. And, many don't know, like you can start a 529 for an unborn child. Like it is possible, but it's not what happens because you just don't. Like that moment hasn't come to really sort of sit down and think about it. So that's a piece of kind of obscurity. I think the other part is many of us are saving for retirement. We're contributing to an employee sponsored plan or on our own. The benefit of that type of goal is typically you have time, right? Like you have the latitude of time and contributions and dollar cost averaging and compounding and whatnot. And so the current planning conundrum for me, and I think a lot of the individuals I work with, is the decision is made at kind of this point in time. If I look back 10 years, 24-year-old Cam was not socialized to think that this was something I should be planning for and saving for. I just don't think we're there in terms of a society and socializing that this is something we should be planning for.
Yeah, there's two in a perfect world scenarios. One is in a perfect world, every young woman in her early 20s would start saving for this. But in a more perfect world, we wouldn't have to, right? We'd have insurance programs that cover it. It would not be deemed elective. Our employers, to the extent of their ability, would be able to cover it. Or fertility treatments would evolve to such a point where proactively anticipating that you may need your eggs would not be required.
And it's a big cost. There's the cost of the initial consult, which I again think is so important and individuals should do if this is even kind of a small consideration of theirs. But that could be $500. There's treatment. That's the stimulation, monitoring, retrieval, the labs. That could be around $10,000. That's a real kind of big kahuna of costs. There's a medication piece, which is not really included in the treatment piece. That could be another $4,000 or $5,000. And there's the annual storage of the eggs, which is around $1,000. All of those don't even represent the opportunity cost of doing that. Like the time you take to go to the appointments, those appointments increase in cadence as you get closer to the retrieval date, the recovery period, and being off of work, maybe not even being off of work, but also being a caregiver and not being able to contribute from a care perspective. So there are also a lot of opportunity costs that I don't think get factored in.
Oh, you're absolutely right. If you think about it too, it's not if I spend this $15,000+, I will guarantee that I can have a child later on. There's some unknown, right? Because they don't know the quality of your eggs at the time of freezing. They don't know how you're going to react to treatment down the road when you want to use them. They don't know about the thawing process. I mean, there's just such uncertainty here. The only thing that is certain is that if you don't freeze your eggs and you don't meet your partner in time, that there's a very real clock. You started the conversation by saying this. There's a very real clock and you might miss an opportunity. So you're spending all this money and cost physically, emotionally, psychologically, financially for the preservation of a dream.
Yeah, it's a really interesting point. Part of my internet deep dive research, what I noticed is there is this highly debated idea of egg freezing as insurance. And people were getting really heated about the fact that it wasn't insurance. And I was like, well, wait a minute, like, let me think about this. And if you think about insurance in its current form, you have an asset that you want to protect. It could be a physical asset, it could be a stream of income or whatnot, and you buy insurance in the case that something happens to that asset. And if that pans out, you receive some sort of monetary payout. So I thought through that and I was like, I understand why people are up in arms because egg freezing is not that. There are no guarantees, there are no payouts, but it is just an option to sound kind of like financial for a second.
I feel like I'm actually very good at my job, you know.
I know, to exercise that fertility option down the road. Again, there are no guarantees, there are no payouts, but you have increased that time and runway. So I always thought that was interesting. And I kind of go back into those internet groups and be like, no, it's not insurance, it's an option. But I think I'm done with the internet on this one.
I love that you're nerding out on this in the best possible way. And because we get to benefit from all of your research. So let me ask a theoretical. Again, I'm your client and I haven't done the savings that I want to have done. And $15,000 is a lot of money. I just don't have that necessarily. Does that mean I don't get to preserve my option to have kids? What do I do?
No, it does not. And this is important to talk about. For those who may be listening who have time, I do think it's something that you have a separate savings bucket every month for, let's just call it 10 years, and reinvest that money, and via contributions and the power of compounding, like you can probably get there if you're contributing $100 a month. I realize that's a lot of money, but it's a lot more tangible than $15,000 right now. One thing, getting back to spring fertility, that I noticed and was so appreciative of and actually took advantage of was their kind of total costs from a treatment perspective. There is only a $50 difference if you split that up in the total cost, not in monthly payments, if you split that up over 40 months. No interest rate, no penalty besides that kind of $50 more total cost, which is, in the grand scheme of things, fairly small. And I had this moment because I had that money saved up. I was ready to see it go out. And I was like, oh, well, why wouldn't I do that if I can pay $140 a month? I think that's it for the next 40 months versus sending that larger amount of money out the door and not being able to use it and think about other ways to kind of employ it in my life. There are those options and I would absolutely explore them. And that was something that I thought was kind of a terrific option.
It's amazing because it's not easy to have a conversation about money, and it's not easy to have a conversation about our dreams and hopes around family. And here, egg freezing is one of those things that it all comes together in a very complicated way. You're spending a lot of money in the here and now to preserve a possible, not guaranteed future. And in the same way, financial planning and saving is, I'm going to make choices in the here and now to preserve options in the future for other dreams, for the house that I want, or the vacations I want, or retirement that I need. So I really appreciate that you can talk to us at the intersection of all of those things. Has your relationship with either money or your hopes and dreams around family building changed as a result of going through this process?
I'm in the position where I talk about money all day. I think about money all day, hopefully in like the best way of building it for those individuals that I work with and for myself and using it to its best possible form. I don't think that has changed beyond the real frustration that this is one more thing that women have to pay for.
Yes.
That to me is just like dagger in the heart. Come on, this is just one more thing. So I think that's the gripe from a money perspective. It's actually really interesting. Like from a vision perspective, I felt like I've gone from a perspective and expectation of what something should look like, be that a family or where I should be at a certain point in time, to a realization and honestly a degree of comfort. And I think in many ways aided by this process that I have like absolutely no idea what that is. I don't know. It's super blurry. It's almost this moment of reverse clarity for me. But again, I feel better about it because I have that time, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it sounds like the safety net gives you the ability to not be so rigid with your hopes and dreams. And I love that, the like reverse clarity. I have two questions and we will wrap up. The first is, we were talking about celebrations and how much your community was celebrating you. When you think about where you are right now, what is it that you want to celebrate about yourself?
It's a great question. I mean, I want to celebrate the fact that I did it because I've been considering it for a long period of time. But I think I want to celebrate the fact that what we talked about before, I've gone from a very like rigid, programmatic expectation of embracing the unknown, of things that come into my life and just being able to explore it wholeheartedly.
Yeah, I appreciate that. It's funny. I'm trying not to make this about me, but as you talk, I just keep getting these flashbacks to my own experience with egg freezing. And I think I've never felt more empowered than when I did it. And I did it 5 years ago. I have to say that sense of like, this is my life and I've got complete control over it. I think that started with my egg freezing. I think it was one of those major moments where I said, wow, I've got this. And it's never left. 5 years later, I still feel like, I got this. If you remember, but back at the time, there was the power poses were really popular and they've since debunked them. But everyone was standing in the bathrooms, putting their hands up and standing in powerful poses. And it was like that. The egg freezing is the life equivalent of the 2-minute power pose.
I agree 100%.
Okay, last question. This is the question I ask all of my guests. And that is, how do you define family? In a word, a sentence, an image, what does family mean to you?
I mean, to me, family is community. It could be people you're related to or you're not. Like I go back to this idea that I'm actually physically very far away from direct family, but have like a tremendous community where I sit right now. So I think it's those moments where you can reflect on it and appreciate it and thank that community for that. I truly do feel, and I don't mean to get very touchy-feely, but that family component from that perspective it's never felt more robust. And I will say, going back to this process, I renewed appreciation for people going for it. And I do actually think when you have friends or family members going through this, it has to be a pay it forward mentality, because I actually went back to a lot of girlfriends and apologized for not being the friend that I probably should have been when they went through this process. Unfortunately, because I didn't really know what it entailed. And now that I know, I think there's very much a pay it forward mentality, whether it's come on over for that first night, or I'll pick you up during your retrieval, and everything in between. To me, that's how I would define family.
What a note to end on. Cam, where can we find you?
I'm Cameron Rogers. LinkedIn purposes, I work at Ellevest. I should be pretty easy to find. And if anyone does have questions, either on the personal front or the financial planning front, please find us at Ellevest. Yeah.
Awesome. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to Stork'd with your host, Julia Carroll. This podcast is changing the conversation around the ways people define and create family. If you like what you hear, please support us by sharing with friends and following on Instagram at Stork'd_podcast. We also always appreciate it when you rate and review us wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts. For more information, visit storkedpodcast.com to sign up for our newsletter. That's STORKD podcast.com.
I am thrilled to share and extend a free level 2 subscription to the California Cryobank Donor Catalog by using the promo code STORK'd, that's STORKD, at cryobank.com. You will receive free access for 90 days, which is an $145 value.